Okay, good morning, students. Let's hope the others will join soon. Let us continue with our discussion on third cinema. We were talking about the movie that was made by the Argentinian filmmakers Solanas and Getino in the year 1968, which marked a new turn in filmmaking. And this was followed by the manifesto that they wrote in the next year to try and explain to the world what this new cinema was all about and how it was very significant to develop that kind of third cinema. So it was a kind of praxis, theory and practice. The theory in the manifesto and the practice having already been established or conveyed through the film that was made in 1968. I think we will have Naina making a presentation on The Hour of the Furnaces. So we'll wait for that I hope I had insisted that you watch the documentary. I hope at least some of you have done it. So, only then will you actually be able to make sense of what they are trying to convey in the manifesto. In any case, we'll catch up with that film, and today we will discuss the essay or the manifesto. This was actually only one of the manifestos, but the one that happens to be probably the most famous. The other manifestos, some of them were actually, one of them was actually written in the year 1965. That was Glauber Rocha's Aesthetic of Hunger. That is often considered as one of the manifestos of third cinema. Then you have another one by Julio Garcia Espinosa that is called For an Imperfect Cinema. It is different from the perfect cinema that was made till then. This is imperfect cinema. That was written in the same year as this one, Toward a Third Cinema, in the year 1969. Then you have another one by Jorge Sanginas. It is called Problems of Form and Content in Revolutionary Cinema. So imperfect cinema, revolutionary cinema, these are some of the terms used by other critics. In any case, these three essays may be considered as manifestos, along with the one that has been prescribed for our study. The last one that I mentioned was written in 1976, much later, therefore. Anyway, we will now focus our attention on the essay or the manifesto written by Solanas and Getino in the year 1969, Toward a Third Cinema. But to reach the manifesto, let us just quickly take a look at the film itself and the powerful impact that it left. I'll just read a few lines of commentary on the film made by the British Film Institute. I hope the screen is visible to you. Yeah, so this is what the British Film Institute said about The Hour of the Furnaces, the movie made by Solanas and Getino. They called it a demonstration and a lesson. It imports into cinema the affirmative aesthetics of written political treatise. So it is a political treatise. At the same time, it is an aesthetic product too. A collective ideal informs the whole film. It's never an individual enterprise. Neither the director, nor the character, nor the star outshines anyone here. At every stage, third cinema is a collective ideal. The Hour of the Furnaces was one such film. A collective ideal informs the whole film. It anticipates a liberated time. So it is a kind of film that clamors for liberation, for freedom. It's not the product of a single voice, but of a chorus of many voices, actually. You have poems, you have films, other films, you have manifestos, It conjoins the powers of didacticism, poetry, and agogy. There is teaching, didacticism there, but there is also poetry, a great deal of aesthetic value, and there is music too. Agogy is something that is related to music. And therefore, stylistically, the film uses all possible audio-visual techniques, from flicker to contemplative sequence shots. So it experiments with every kind of technical possibility with regard to the audio and visual quality, from collage to direct cinema, from blank screen to animated effects, from the rigors of the blackboard to the hallucinogenic properties of the fish eye. So it is realistic and surreal at the same time. It is, a combination of so many experimental techniques, from classical music to Anglophone pop hits. Cinema is an arsenal, and here all its weapons are unsheathed. Cinema is, an arsenal. Arsenal is a firearm, something with which you can fight. We have already seen how they considered film to be the camera to be a gun or a rifle. So cinema is an arsenal, and here all its weapons are unsheathed. I think this statement made by the British Film Institute about the hours of the furnaces is very significant. In a nutshell, it encapsulates what not just this film is, but what third cinema is all about. And here is a famous remark made by Godard, one of the representatives of second cinema, who had great respect for the kind of cinema that was being made in third world situations, or the third cinema. This is what Godard, during the course of an interview, he had interviewed Solanas and Gatineau in Paris, and after that, this is what he wrote in, again, a very powerful revolutionary magazine called Cinétique. He said, during the screening of an imperialist film, the screen sells the voice of the boss to the viewer. That is very much like what first cinema is all about. You may consider it an imperialist film because it is a film that comes from a very powerful first world nation. It sells the voice of the boss to the viewer. The boss is the ruler here. The voice flatters, represses, or bludgeons. During the screening of a revisionist film, a film that comes from another area, a revisionist version, a revisionist film, on the other hand, the screen is only the loudspeaker of a voice delegated by the people, but which is no longer the voice of the people, for the people watch their own disfigured face in silence. So that is another kind of cinema. You may call it revisionist. It revises what was conveyed by the imperialist film. But even in that kind of revisionist film, the audience, is only a spectator. During the screening of an activist film, however, the kind of films made by Gatineau and Solanas, and which may be called third cinema, the screen is just a blackboard or the wall of a school, providing a concrete analysis of a concrete situation. So I think these two assessments are very significant, laying the platform for us to discuss third cinema, which if we were to define it in very simple terms, third cinema means decolonization of culture. This is the important assessment made by Solanas and Gatineau. The aim of third cinema is the decolonization of culture. After the period of colonization, we know that the colonial hangover hung heavy, particularly on culture. This is what we had discussed in, when we discussed post-colonial literature, when we discussed the work of Edward Said and Ella Shohat. We kept repeating this. It is in the field of culture that you have the colonial hangover retaining itself, or being retained, and that the field of culture being decolonized. That is what is the aim of third cinema. That is what third cinema achieves. It is not, you cannot consider it as a particular form of cinema. Like you may say German expressionist cinema or Soviet montage film. You cannot call third cinema as a particular form of cinema. It is actually a concept. According to them, it is a concept. And what does this concept mean? This is a concept which challenges first cinema and criticizes second cinema. It challenges whatever first cinema stands for, and it deeply criticizes second cinema. And at the end of the day, the objective of third cinema is to liberate the people's culture and consciousness from the colonial and neo-colonial influences. This essay, the one of the manifestos, one among the 4 manifestos recognized by critics as manifestos of third cinema, the one written by Solanas and Gatineau. Actually, it was published simultaneously, almost simultaneously in 4 different languages: English, French, Spanish, and one more language. In any case, the first appearance of this essay came out in the 1969 version, the issue of Tricontinental. It's a very powerful magazine. We've already discussed this magazine and its contributions in various situations, post-colonial situations. It was in this magazine that the essay was first published in 1969. And to begin our discussion, I think we may just make a few introductory remarks about third cinema. As already explained, it is the cinema of decolonization, films of decolonization that turned their back on or actively opposed the system, the prevailing system, whatever that is, the system that was left behind by the colonizer or the system that developed in various nations after the period of colonization. That is also the establishment, and that was equally colonial in its outlook. Many of the dictatorial regimes that came up in third world countries that had gained their political freedom from the colonizer, but which continued to struggle under pretty much the same situations, because the new regime that came into power just continued the oppressive practices of the colonizer. So that is why they take on the system, they oppose the system. So third cinema is that which has decolonization as its aim and which actively opposes the establishment of the system. And we need to remember that unlike our conventional understanding of cinema, third cinema is not mere spectacle. Its aim is not entertainment. It is not a consumer good, which the audience can consume, like commercial cinema, which only deals with effect and never the cause. The first cinema or the commercial cinema has as its interest only the effect. What impact does it have on the audience? Is the audience entertained? Fine, that is good for cinema. But here, they never bother about the cause, what led to this. So this is the kind of cinema which analyzes both cause and effect. Third cinema. Third cinema, further, unlike second cinema, is not mystical or anti-historical or surplus value cinema. What does surplus value cinema mean? The kind of cinema which satisfies only the ideological and economic interests of the owners of the film industry, those people who are powerful enough to own production houses and who can dictate terms. So unlike first cinema, unlike second cinema, it is not a mere spectacle, it is not meant for mere entertainment, it is not merely a consumer good, it is not mystical, it is not anti-historical either. Now, when there were attempts being made in many such third world countries, particularly in South America and many Latin American countries, to make films which were different from the kind of films that were being made in Hollywood and in other European centers of cinema. There were many people who criticized it and who actually looked down upon their attempts. They kept deterring it. They kept dissuading them. They kept saying that this will not succeed because they believe that without the support of the political establishment, you cannot make any new kind of cinema. So the conventional opinion was that revolutionary cinema cannot exist before the revolution, that revolutionary films have been possible only in liberated countries. Revolutionary films in that sense, according to the critics, who kept dissuading the makers of new kind of films. They said, they use the word revolutionary films to denote a new kind of film. They said new films, new experiments, new waves can be possible only in liberated countries and only with the powerful support of the political power. Revolutionary cinema or art is impossible without the support of the political establishment. And they kept saying that this is very difficult to change. The situation is difficult to change and you just cannot make new films. But in the 1960s, after all these countries had become independent, after the new governments had been established, you have a new kind of wave emerging in various parts of the world. The world was witness, especially in the latter half of the 1960s, many revolutionary movements. You have the Cuban Revolution, you have the Vietnamese struggle against the Americans, you have the movement in Paris, a lot of worldwide liberation movements in the 1960s. So the third cinema is actually a visual manifestation of these worldwide liberation movements. A new historical situation emerged. A new man was born in the process of the anti-imperialist struggle, and this new man demanded a new revolutionary attitude from the filmmakers. Not just filmmakers, from every artist, but particularly filmmakers, because film is, without any doubt, the most powerful of all art forms. So the question of whether or not militant cinema was possible before the revolution began to be replaced, at least in small groups in various parts of the world. And from this point onwards, in the 1960s, the question of whether or not such a cinema was necessary to contribute to the possibility of revolution. That sentence has to be read in its entirety. The question of whether or not militant cinema was possible before the revolution began to be replaced by what? By the question of whether or not such a cinema was necessary to contribute to the possibility of revolution. So that was the question. In other words, it really became a possibility, and whether or not it was aiding revolution was the question. In other words, they proved that such films could be made. Now, one of the reasons why the making of such films became problematic, when you analyze it well enough, according to Solanas and Gatinos, is the fact that very often we separate politics and art. This is a universal phenomenon. In the first place, we think of art, culture, science, cinema, all of these as a kind of specialist activity, which can be handled only by a certain group of people. Remember the Raymond Williams essay where the same point was made? That understanding of culture, science, art, it is something that prevails all over the world. And secondly, this is one of the major difficulties. The second difficulty is that people do not actually have a lot of clarity about the fact that revolution does not begin with the taking of political power from imperialism and the bourgeoisie. That moment of gaining freedom is not what is important, but revolution actually begins at the moment when the masses sense the need for change and their intellectual vanguards begin to study and carry out this change through activities on different fronts. In other words, real revolution is that which is among the people. It is not, the real change does not begin with the gaining of independence, with the handing over of power to a new group. Not at all. Real revolution begins when the people begin to sense that they need change, and they rise in action to ensure that change for themselves. So that these 2 points have to be kept in mind. First of all, that culture, art, science, films, these are not elitist at all. They belong to the people. Okay? And secondly, revolution can occur not with political transfer of power, but with the people rising in action. Yeah, so they talk in detail about the neo-colonial situation. After the granting of political independence, what prevailed in most of these third world countries was a kind of neo-colonial situation. Colonialism repeating itself in new versions, either with the Americanization or with the new regimes taking on the same attitude as the earlier colonizer. So in these new colonial situations, the two concepts of culture, art, science, and cinema compete, that of the rulers and of the nation. So there is always that, that situation that as long as the national concept is not identified with that of the rulers, as long as the status of the colony or semi-colony continues in force, this situation will continue. And during that phase, without any doubt, there will always be that divide between their culture, our culture. And willy-nilly, even in a very unconscious manner, the understanding will be that the colonizer's culture is great, the master's culture is great, and we need to copy them, we need to rise to their level. So this is the situation in which, a really new, original kind of cinema or art does not emerge. They call it the dependent state. The dependent state is a very submissive kind of state. Even though you are politically free, you actually continue to remain in a state of being colonized. You remain dependent, not politically probably, but definitely culturally. You remain in a dependent state. So this is the situation that prevails in most of the post-colonial countries. The culture, including the cinema, in these neo-colonized countries is just an expression of overall dependence that generates models born from the needs of imperialist expression. They continue to hold their cinema as good cinema, their art as good art. And they try to follow the colonizers or the masters' language, culture, everything, and ultimately it leads to a kind of sterility. There is nothing new and original coming out during that dependent situation. And this same idea was conveyed by another important writer, Spanish writer, Juan José Hernandez Arregui, who in Imperialism and Culture said, in order to impose itself, neocolonialism needs to convince the people of a dependent country of their own inferiority. They need to convince the people that you are inferior. Sooner or later, the inferior man recognizes man with a capital M. This recognition means the destruction of his defenses. If you want to be a man, the oppressor continues to say, you have to be like me, speak my language and deny your very being. So this is a characteristic feature of that dependent state. And it makes serious attempts to castrate, to digest the cultural forms that arise beyond the bounds of its own aim. So the powerhouse will always try to suppress any attempt on the part of new artists to raise their voice. And attempts are made to remove from them exactly that which makes them effective and dangerous. The suppression of dissent. We see that in various parts of the world, even today. It is all a continuation of that dependent state. It tries to depoliticize these emerging artists. So this is particularly true, they say, Getino and Solanas say, in Latin America, and a majority of those countries where you have the imperialist domination. Even after gaining political independence, we are not moving towards a lessening of repression, but actually there is an increase of repression. We are not heading for bourgeois democratic regimes, but for dictatorial forms of government. This is particularly true in most of the Latin American countries, because even after the period of Spanish and Portuguese colonization, the new regimes that emerged in each one of these countries, whether it is Argentina or Peru or Chile or Bolivia, in each one of these countries, Guatemala, in all of these countries, you have Nicaragua, Central American and South American countries, new dictatorial regimes which are as bad as the colonial regimes, which kept continuing to plunder the masses, and many of them were actually supported by the new colonizer, that is America. America was interested in giving a lot of support to these puppet dictators. They allowed these dictators to emerge in these countries. This is what is America's foreign policy, so that they could control them. They could, use them like clockwork toys and plunder those colonies. So the struggles for democratic freedoms, instead of seizing concessions from the system, move it to cut down on them, given its narrow margin for maneuvering. And so the artists are kept in control, saying that your art is bad. You must always aspire to universal art and models, and make no doubt about it. You need not have any doubt about it. What they convey as universal art and models would be mainly Yankee, American. Okay, so this is the kind of situation that prevailed, a new colonial situation which totally suppressed the artistic ventures on the part of the new filmmakers, the new artists, the new aestheticians, and so on. And they, after having described that situation in very powerfully aware terms, they conclude that this dependent state can be overcome only through revolutionary means, because it is a deep-rooted state. The dependent state is so deep-rooted, and to uproot it, you need really powerful means. You need revolutionary means. The intellectual must find through his action the field in which he can rationally perform the most efficient work. Once they have identified that front, the next task is to find out within that front exactly what is the enemy's stronghold and where and how he must deploy his forces. Again, no doubt, that is the field of culture. It is in this harsh and dramatic daily search that a culture of the revolution will be able to emerge, the basis which will nurture the new man capable of arising from the ashes of the old, alienated man that we are, and which the new man will destroy by starting to stoke the fire today. So that is how they, it's a very, very poetic way of expressing the idea of revolution. So the revolutionary is a much hated person. As has already been explained, they will always try to suppress these revolutionary bandits, revolutionary voices. Always they see the revolutionary as a bandit, a robber, a rapist. Wherever there is dissent, we know that the government in power will try to stamp them as anti-national people, as bandits, as robbers, as rapists, and so on. So they will be arrested, they will be charged with a lot of crimes and so on. The more exploited a man is, the more he is placed on a plane of insignificance. The more he resists, the more he is viewed as a beast. So the revolutionary is always seen as enemy number one. And this is where, the revolutionaries' real power lies. They introduce the need to make revolutionary films. In any revolutionary society, the traditional forms of media, like newspapers and every other kind of printed matter. You can have propaganda posters, you can have propaganda magazines, leaflets, speeches, all these verbal forms of information, enlightenment, and politicization. They're very, very important, they're very powerful. They're the main means of communication between the organizations and the common people. But you need to move a little beyond that. It is not simply enough to remain with these newspapers and speeches and all that. Powerful as they are, we also need to move into the realm of films. The new political position of some filmmakers and the subsequent appearance of films useful for liberation have permitted certain political vanguards to discover the importance of movies. Even as we retain the importance of newspapers and all those printed and verbal forms of resistance, let us move one step ahead and think of employing movies for revolutionary ends. This is to be found in the specific meaning of films as a form of communication, the most powerful means of communication, and also because of their particular characteristics that allow them to draw audiences of different origins, many of them people who might not respond favorably to the announcement of a political speech. So the mass appeal of cinema is what they are talking about. Interestingly, it was the same point that was made by Stalin when he wanted a particular kind of state-sponsored cinema to be popularized. The same kind of speech that might have been made by, what is his name? Mussolini, when he wanted, Cinecittà to produce a certain kind of cinema. So look at that, the powerful means that, or the power of cinema. So film offer an effective pretext for gathering an audience in addition to the ideological message they contain. So people might not be interested in listening to a speech or reading an article, but everyone will be interested in watching a movie. And so films are being used in many parts of the world, they say, to lead a revolution against the system. Some of the circumstances that delayed the use of film as a revolutionary tool until a short time ago were the lack of equipment, the technical difficulties they face, and so on. But with newer developments on all those fronts, the scene has become very different. It has opened up, and many new filmmakers can now enter the field and make films that can speak to masses of people. It is increasingly within the reach of larger social layers. I'm just quoting important sections from the manifesto. As I told you, it's a very long article, and when you read it, I think these points that I have included in this presentation will be helpful to you. So the liberated nations doesn't mean a liberated people. To convey how important it is to make revolutionary cinema, they say it is important to make the people understand the need for them to be liberated. Just because they have become politically independent does not mean that they are mentally liberated. A liberated people is achieved when the culture and politics is properly decolonized. Beyond the political freedom, you need decolonization of culture and decolonization of politics. So that is what Third Cinema can do. And in this manifesto, they try to explain the dependent culture and its effect on the post-colonial countries. They're trying to highlight through their film and through this article all the ills of the dependent culture, its effect on post-colonial countries, and then this manifesto proposes a kind of cinema that can combat, that can resist the colonial and neo-colonial influence in post-colonial countries. So a new kind of cinema has to emerge, and that is what they call Third Cinema. To repeat a point that has already been made, they differentiate Third Cinema from the already existing films, which they characterize largely into two groups. One is the bourgeois film made by the capitalist who owns the means of production and who makes of the audience a mere passive consuming object. And in such films, man is viewed as a consumer of ideology and not as a creator of ideology. The audience remains a very satisfied, passive, consuming audience. Now, as a kind of reaction against that, you had the emergence of second cinema. There were artistic directors who wanted to make their own kind of films, auteur cinema. We will not be dictated, we will not be directed by the production houses. We want to make films that satisfy our aesthetic ideas. And therefore, you have the emergence of second cinema. Was it an alternative to bourgeois cinema? To a certain extent, yes. But did it appeal to the people and change the people? Not at all. Because second cinema also, in many ways, made the audience passive. The director was able to express himself or herself, but the audience again remained passive. And actually, it was as elitist as first cinema. So the auteur cinema or the author cinema, expression cinema, cinema novo, etc., what is considered second cinema, it definitely was a move against first cinema, but actually, you can see that second cinema became, it's as if, to quote Godard, the filmmaker was trapped inside the fortress and they could not really speak to the audience. And that speaking is what is needed and which can be provided by third cinema. Third cinema, according to Gatineau and Solanas, is the real alternative. It differs from those that are offered by the establishment, and they made films that the system cannot assimilate and which are foreign to its needs, making films that directly and explicitly set out to fight the system or the establishment. So that is the cinema of liberation, the third cinema. And it is at the same time one of destruction and construction. When you call it revolutionary cinema, let us not be mistaken and think that its aim is only destruction, destroying the old order. No, it destroys the old order and constructs a new kind of order. Destruction of the image that neocolonialism has created of itself and of us, and more importantly, construction of a throbbing, living reality which recaptures truth in any of its expressions. And they talk about the importance of documentary films, testimony. Testimony is where you have these leaders, revolutionaries, speaking themselves, not making actors come and act out roles, but the real leaders, the real people speaking. So the documentary is very, very significant. It's a kind of educational film that can reconstruct a fact or a historical event, and it is one of the main ingredients of revolutionary filmmaking. Testimonio, again, it's a national reality, and it's an inestimable means of dialogue and knowledge on the world plane. It is not fabricated dialogue, it is real dialogue. It really speaks from experience. So that is also an important aspect of third cinema. It directly combats first cinema and strongly criticizes second cinema. And the basic concept of third cinema is to make a film which incorporates the lively reality of the people who are marginalized, who belong to the common arena, and therefore third cinema can also be called people's cinema. I think I will stop there because it is 12 and in 5 minutes I have another hour. There are certain important points remaining in this essay which talk about the characteristic features of third cinema and the two important ways of making third cinema. We'll discuss that in the next class. I'll stop for the moment. Okay, I'll stop the recording now.